Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to do a book review of a book that I just finished last night, so it's fresh in my head and I've got a lot of thoughts on it. So I wanted to get this out as soon as possible. So I'm going to be speaking about Orson Scott Card's Speaker for the Dead. So for those of you who don't know, this is the second book in publication history to the Ender series. So the Ender series started in 1985 with Ender's Game. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. It's very popular. One of the kind of classics of modern sci-fi. There was a big movie version of it a few years ago. And this came out just the following year in 1986. So Speaker for the Dead from 1986, 36 years ago, I think. And yeah, a bit of publication history. I think this was actually meant to be the book. This was supposed to be the first book. And then I think to make it simpler for audiences to understand, there was a short story about the main character Ender as a young boy. And so Orson Scott Card and the publisher decided to turn that short story into a novel, which became Ender's Game, and that came out first, and then this was the sequel. So yeah, so a bit of plot background. So for Ender's Game, the first book in the series, it's a really kind of classic of, military sci-fi. And it wasn't YA. It was kind of before how YA is so popular now. It was kind of before YA was as big of a genre, but it kind of reads YA at times because it focuses almost entirely on children, on young children. So even if it's not YA, I don't mean that it reads YA, but I mean it's often a pretty good starting entry point for a lot of younger readers into the science fiction genre. I know a lot of people who it was one of their first science fiction books, and it was for me too. I read Ender's Game when I was, I think, 10, and then again when I was 15, and I haven't read it since. So it's been about 10 years now. So yeah, but the plot of Ender's Game, I'll be kind of spoilery, but quick on Ender's Game, and then I'll try to avoid most of the spoilers for Speaker for the Dead. But I will there's some things I have to talk about. So Ender's Game follows a young boy, Ender, who is essentially the third child of this family, and in the world, on Earth, in this story, you're only allowed to have 2 kids, and one of them has to go to the military because Earth is in a very long war with these aliens called the Formics, but they're also known as the Buggers because they look very insect-like. And so this one family, the son, Peter, is deemed too masochistic, too cruel for the military, which is kind of interesting. And then the daughter, Valentine, is deemed too empathetic for the military. So this family is allowed to have a third kid, and they do, whose name is Andrew Wiggin, and he goes by Ender. And he's shipped off to the military to kind of an orbiting kind of martial academy. And the book is largely about him at that academy, overcoming challenges there, making friends, maybe allies, maybe not friends, but making allies, dealing with conflict, and working through kind of simulations, essentially games, of the war with the Buggers. And sorry for the spoilers for Ender's Game. It did come out, 37 years ago. In one of these games, in one of these simulations, he actually defeats the Bugger army by essentially wiping them all out. He essentially exterminates the entire Bugger homeworld. And then the big twist is that it wasn't a game, that he was lied to, and that he actually did just win the war for Earth by annihilating this entire species. So that's Ender's Game. And then Speaker for the Dead is an interesting sequel, and I think it's because it wasn't meant to be a sequel. It was meant to be its own book at first, because it's definitely a weird sequel. It doesn't pick up right after. It actually picks up 3,000 years later. And so in this book, or in the time between the 2 books, essentially Earth has colonized a lot of planets. They're now known as the 100 Worlds. And Ender, this young boy, who is kind of thought to be long dead now because it's been 3,000 years, Ender was at first kind of renowned and celebrated as this kind of hero for Earth who defeated the buggers. But then the speaker for the dead, this kind of figure that we find out is Ender, he wrote a book called The Hive Queen and the Hegemon, which essentially, as a speaker for the dead, his job is to, not give a eulogy, but give as accurate and as compassionate and empathetic an account of whoever died as he can, to get people to understand not just what that person did in their lives, but their intentions, their hopes, their desires, things like that. So Ender wrote a book called The Hive Queen and the Hegemon, which was a speaking partially for humanity and for the buggers. So Ender, because of that book largely, the character of Ender, who again is thought to be dead at this point, went from a hero to now being known as a monster. Humanity reviles him as Ender the Xenocide, Ender the monster, because he wiped out the only other known intelligent alien species in known space. And then right before this book, essentially the setup for this one is that a new world is discovered called Lusitania, and essentially the Catholic Church gets the exploratory license. So it is colonized by Portuguese Catholics, and they discover a new intelligent alien species on this world known as piggies, which are kind of, I always think of those, I forget their names, but the little creatures in Star Wars The Last Jedi, the little penguin little creatures. In my head they kind of look like that. But yeah, so this alien species called the piggies, I think they're called the Pequeninos, but they're kind of known as the piggies as a kind of nickname. And they're intelligent, they learn human languages really fast, they build houses, they have, all that stuff. And so humanity views this as a kind of second chance, as a kind of a chance for redemption. So the small colony of the Portuguese Catholic, settlers are allowed to go there, but they're kind of stuck in a very small area, and the kind of guiding principle of the colony is that they cannot harm or interfere with the piggies' way of life. They can kind of study them a little bit, but there's very strict rules about how they study them, because they cannot interfere with the piggies' way of life. So that's the kind of background, and essentially the story of this book, and again, I'm going to try to keep certain things spoiler free, but I'll have to spoil some things. Essentially, it follows some of the scientists, or the xenologers, on Lusitania, studying the piggies, and essentially one and then both of them are killed by the piggies in quite a graphic way. They're essentially vivisected, so they're kind of dissected, their organs are kind of left outside of their body in a very ritualistic, precise way. And it's discovered that piggies do this to other piggies as well, but when they do it to other piggies, they seem to plant a tree in the middle of the body. But they haven't done this for the humans. So that's kind of the setup for the story, is that these murders happen, and it changes the dynamics between the humans and the piggies. And Ender, who is now a speaker for the dead, but people don't realize that he's the speaker for the dead that wrote the Hive Queen and the Hive Queen and the Hegemon, and they don't realize that he's Ender the Xenocide. They think those people are long gone. He is kind of called to Lusitania to speak the deaths of these xenologers, these scientists that were killed. So yeah, and then the one other spoilery thing, I won't tell you what happens kind of with the piggies, and because I'll get into that in a moment. But the other thing is that you find out that he is actually carrying a cocoon with the last Hive Queen of the buggers. He was kind of led there by the buggers in their kind of last moments. And so he has got a cocoon that could restart the bugger population. So that's the kind of overarching story of Speaker for the Dead. So in terms of its structure and its framing, there's two things that I think this book does really well and makes it, really intriguing to read. So one of them is that, it's really an anthropological science fiction book. And Orson Scott Card talks about that in the introduction, that he was really enamored when he was younger by certain kind of classic anthropological sci-fi. And what I mean by that is books or stories where, it's a human character learning of and interacting with and studying a wildly different, species. So interacting with aliens that have a completely different biology, a completely different culture, a completely different view of community and religion and things like that. So the book is very anthropological in that sense. A lot of the chapters start with kind of field notes from the scientists in the book. So I think that makes it really intriguing because the piggies are quite strange, and as the reader, you want to learn more and more. And so it's structured in a really cool way where you feel like you're learning along with these scientists. You're slowly getting more and more bits of useful information about the piggies' way of life and what their actions might mean. And then the other kind of framing thing is that this book largely is a mystery, because it follows, the kind of inciting incident is the murder of the first scientist. And that sets off the mystery of this book of, well, why did the piggies do this? Why did they do it to themselves? Why did they do it to this human? Especially because there didn't seem to be any malice or hatred to it. The piggies go on interacting with the couple of scientists very peacefully and jovially even. So it's this kind of mystery of, well, what does this ritual mean and how do we understand that? And so given that mystery, Ender, the speaker for the dead, is kind of positioned as the only one who could really understand that, because it's his job to understand people's motives despite whatever their actions are. So then moving into a couple of the themes that this book really tackles, I thought in a really poignant and powerful way. Because of the anthropological nature of it, this book is really about difference in a lot of ways and how to understand and navigate difference of culture. Ender's task is essentially to come to this planet, Lusitania, and try to understand the lives of the scientists who were killed, and also to try to understand the piggy culture and biology and everything about their society he can. This is where it gets into the other theme, which is kind of guilt and redemption. So I think this is where, the book does a really interesting thing where there's kind of two Enders. He's got two parts of his identity here, and they really interact and inform each other. And so one of them is Ender the Xenocide, so the boy soldier who wiped out the only other intelligent alien species in the galaxy at that time. And then now there's, Ender the speaker for the dead, the one whose job it is to ensure that empathy and compassion and understanding can exist between people, precisely to make sure that something like that never happens again. So he's coming to this world to try to understand the piggies, to make sure that they won't one day be wiped out by humanity as well. Because there's now fear of the piggies because they did such a horrible act, as quite brutally murdering a human, multiple humans, but there didn't seem to be any malice in it. So as a speaker for the dead, his job is to kind of look through the act and see the motive. These two kind of parts of Ender, the Xenocide and the speaker, are really interesting because a lot of this book is about him essentially trying to find redemption. He's trying to redeem himself for that kind of original sin of his. And that also plays into how he's got this cocoon. Is essentially, you find out since Ender's Game, he's been traveling. The reason he's still alive is that he's been traveling from world to world, at near light speed. So he is, experiencing time very relativistically. So he's quite young. He's only about 35, even though he was born about 3,000 years ago. And he's had this cocoon with the Hive Queen, and he's trying to find a world where they can be reborn. He's trying to find a world where he can undo his great sin and actually save the buggers and recreate their population. and he thinks Lusitania might be the world that he can do that. So that's the kind of how guilt and redemption plays into this. But also, in a Catholic community like Lusitania, those dynamics are played out really interestingly. So I think religion is handled in a really interesting way in this book. I think science fiction sometimes ignores religion, or even vilifies religion, and sometimes that's valid. Sometimes that story is just not trying to talk about religion. But I think sometimes science fiction really misses out on talking about religion, and it maybe downplays the power of religion in people's lives. So in this book, Ender is kind of viewed, the Speaker for the Dead is not really a religious title, but by the Catholic leadership on this planet, the Speakers for the Dead are really viewed as kind of heretical, atheistic kind of preachers. Some of them even go so far as to kind of call Ender the Antichrist. He's kind of viewed as Satan by some of them. And it's really interesting how in a lot of ways they're actually seeking the same thing. The Catholic priests, the religious leadership, the clerical community, and Ender. They're actually seeking the same thing, and they're trying to do the same thing, but they do it in drastically different ways. And I think the act of speaking shows this so well in this book. I thought it was handled so well, where essentially, Ender's job is, as a speaker, is to, communicate one's life story as accurately as possible to the community that person was from. And so he does this at a couple points in the book. And it's a really painful experience for the community, because not only is he laying bare some of the really terrible things those people did, which can be traumatic in its own way if you didn't know about the terrible things that person did, but for the people who knew that person was terrible, Ender's also not trying to vilify that person. He's also trying to empathize with that person. So in his act of speaking, he is kind of forcing a community to deal with trauma and then to kind of re-deal with it over and over again in new lights. He keeps giving new layers of information that make you see the person he's speaking about in a number of different ways. And so it creates a really interesting tension between him and the Catholic leadership, because they're saying, they say to him that this is confession. This is why we have confession, for people to deal with guilt and sin privately without the shame of the public. And Ender, so they kind of view Ender as cruel. They view him as inflicting wounds on a community, but he views himself as a surgeon who's very particularly, removing or allowing, removing shame, removing trauma, or allowing a community the opportunity to heal collectively. So I think it's really interesting, this dynamic of him as the speaker versus the Catholic leadership, in this kind of idea of speaking as a sort of public confession versus this private confession. So yeah, I loved this book. Highly recommend this book. This quickly, frankly, jumped. It's definitely my favorite book I've read this year, and I think it will easily sit among my favorite books of all time. That being said, am I going to continue on in the series? Which is a good question. I don't know. Because, like I said, Ender's Game, I enjoyed, but it didn't really speak to me in any significant way. This book really spoke to me. It's not the smallest book. It's about 400 pages, and I devoured it in about 3 days. And I loved every second of it. But I always hear, so the original Ender Saga is 4 books. It has Ender's Game, Speaker for the Dead, Xenocide, and Children of the Mind. And I'm not sure, I think I will continue, but I think I'm going to take my time. Xenocide is essentially a direct sequel to this. I won't spoil the ending of this, but it kind of follows directly from, it is the aftermath of some of the decisions that happen at the end of this book and deal with the threat of a second Xenocide. And then the 4th book, Children of the Mind, I think largely follows a character introduced in this book called Jane, who's kind of almost viewed as an entirely other alien species. And she's singular, but she is an AI. She's the first fully kind of realized AI that no one really knows about other than Ender. She has a very close relationship with Ender. So yeah, I'm interested in following because I loved this story. So I'm interested to see what happens next in the story. But I do consistently hear that Xenocide and Children of the Mind are a big step down in quality from this one. So I think I will read Xenocide, but I'm in no rush. And then I will see what I think after that, if I'll continue to do Children of the Mind. And then there's also a parallel series. I think it's kind of just called Ender, or like the Shadow series, which starts with Ender's Shadow, and then I think it's Shadow of the Hegemon, Shadow Puppets, and Shadow of the Giant. And it follows a character that you meet in the first Ender book, Ender's Game, called Bean, and it's kind of his story of meeting Ender in the battle school, doing all that stuff, and then kind of his story going from there. And then more recently, Orson Scott Card has come back to the world. He did Ender in Exile, which takes place in between Ender's Game and this one. He's done some other books that kind of bridge the gap a bit more, I think, between the Ender and the Bean series. So I don't know. I don't know if I'll do any of those. I think I will do Xenocide, the third Ender book, but I'm in no rush because I really, frankly, just want to sit with this one for a long time and let this percolate and let it exist, almost as its own story, connected to Ender's Game, but this really almost exists as its own perfect, just really beautiful story. So yeah, that's my review of Speaker for the Dead. I hope you read it. If you have read it, let me know. If you've read Xenocide or Children of the Mind, let me know how you think the series turns out. And if you have any other sci-fi recommendations, because most of my reading is fantasy, and I really enjoyed kind of getting back into sci-fi with this one. So let me know if you've got any sci-fi recommendations. If I like this one, I might like something else. So yeah, let me know, and thanks for checking in. Take care.